My name is Manjulika. I usually go by MJ. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the CSPC Program Committee volunteer who's helping coordinate today. I want to acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Conference is taking place on the unceded, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. We're about to participate in a series of interactive sessions as part of the EDI Symposium. We're going to start with a panel this morning first, and then we'll have a brief short talk for 10 minutes. We're going to take our first break at 9:15, and then we'll come back, have a second panel, and then we're going to take a second break for 15 minutes at 10:30. And then we'll have our final panel and our final short talk. We want to encourage you, I've been asked to encourage you to tweet about this. So please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference this week. We're going to use the address of with the little, the science policy at hashtag CSPC 2023, CSPC in all caps. And finally, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for the session this morning in the program. You should have a program app, and that's where you can fill that out. Your feedback is really important to us because it helps make CSPC even better for the next year. I hope you enjoy the panels, and thank you very much.
All right, so a warm welcome to everyone. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us so bright and early. I'm going to get right into it because we have very limited time, and we have so many incredible speakers that I'm hoping you're going to really enjoy today. So it's projected that over 70% of future jobs will require STEM knowledge. And as we enter the fourth industrial revolution, it's going to be critical for Canada's stability and economic growth that we address systemic barriers that exist in the field of STEM. So my name is Melanie Ratnam, and I'm currently the president of SWIST. SWIST, the Society for Canadian Women in Science and Technology, has for 40 years advocated to remove these barriers. And our members, for over 40 years, our constituents have voiced the following 5 barriers. So I'm just going to flip back, I think. Excellent. So these are the 5 barriers that SWIST members have voiced for over 40 years. The first being pay equity, EDI in STEM, or IDEA in STEM. The third being childcare accessibility, parental leave, and flexible workplace policies. The fourth being education and leadership. And the fifth being gender-based violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce this incredible panel. And I know we have Commissioner Katie Ward joining us virtually, and so I'm just going to give you a brief introduction about her. She is the current Pay Equity Commissioner and Chief Administrative Officer of Ontario's Pay Equity Office. She is a Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medalist, recognized for her work contributing to significant economic improvement in various Canadian cities. For her podcast series, video and podcast series, Level the Paying Field, exploring issues related to economics, equity, women, work, and money. She was awarded a Gold Quill Award of Merit for excellence in government communications. So join me in welcoming Commissioner Katie Ward. Up next, we have Dr. Nahida Satut. She's an award-winning academic researcher, scientist, and leader. She's currently a policy analyst with Natural Resources Canada, and she's currently External Relations Officer of Science and Braille, which unites professionals in STEAM fields with lived experience of being blind or partially sighted to promote the accessibility of STEAM literacy and education for all. Next, we have, please, thanks. Next, we have Harmy Mendoza. She's well known and respected in her field of violence against women. She's a GBV SME with more than 16 years of experience. And I just want to highlight that Harmy is one of 11 women across the country this year to be honored by Wage Canada for Women's History Month. Thank you. Yes. Next, we have Ainsley Latour. She is the president and co-founder of Ideas STEM, an organization created to enhance the participation and inclusion for people with disabilities in STEM. She identifies as hard of hearing and neurodiverse. Ainsley is Superwoman. But I'm going to highlight one point. She also maintains a practice as a licensed cytogenic and molecular genetic technologist, among many, many things. Please give it up for Ainsley. We have Dr. Andrea Doucette. She is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Gender Work and Care. She's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Center for Gender and Women's Studies at Brock University, and an adjunct research professor at Carleton University and the University of Victoria. She's published widely on care and work experience for diverse families in Canada. She is the author of an award-winning book, Do Men Mother? And you should check out her program, Reimagining Care/Work Policies, which is quite incredible. So I'll leave that with you to check out. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrea Doucette. And finally, we have Dr. Po Tan. She is currently a research fellow at Science World and Vancouver Botanical Gardens Association, Vancouver's Science Museum, and Urban Teaching Garden, where her work focuses on community connections of learning. She is also the founder and CEO of STEM Edge Inc., a STEM educational consulting company, and she was the past president of SWIST. Please welcome Po Tan. All right, we're going to get right into this. So I'm going to start with Nahida. Nahida, if you can start us off with sharing with our audience your lived experience in navigating your incredible career in science.
All right, well, I've been told I have 1.5 minutes to do this, so I'll try and be quick. But as someone who grew up with a visual impairment, I'm very privileged that I had a good schooling. I didn't do my schooling in Canada, and I was very fortunate for that. But as I navigated towards graduate school, it became much more difficult to sort of find a place that would be willing to support and accommodate the special requirements that I would need as someone with a visual impairment. So if we try to use main words, keywords, there were instances where I was not accepted into a lab because I needed a little more time to learn the procedures, and as someone who was doing, I don't know why I decided to do molecular biology or biochemistry, that's another story, but there were instances where this individual didn't want to put me in as a grad student just because I was a little slower in learning the procedures. There were instances where professor didn't trust me in the lab to be alone, so initially would actually ask other people to check up on me. So that was quite interesting. But you know what? Amidst all the negativity that finding accommodations within a lab, there was also positivity, because my graduate supervisor in my PhD was someone who, as long as I got the work done, was okay with me trying to find solutions that would work for me. And so, you know, in the 30 seconds or 10 seconds that I have left, I think it's important to recognize that we have a lot of work in Canada to do with regards to finding solutions for individuals with accessibility needs, especially in the sciences and engineering and other STEM fields. But there are individuals, and I've met a few very incredible individuals over the past 2 years that have shown that there are professors and that there are graduate advisors who are willing to go beyond and above what is required of them to make sure that someone is successful in what they're doing. And I found that during my PhD. I was very fortunate to have colleagues and a supervisor who was willing to work with me. But I think there's so much more work that we need to do. Right.
Thanks so much, Ainsley. I realized I forgot to do some admin at the beginning here. Just to make the Q&A quite efficient towards the end, please feel free to use the Slido, so either the number there or the QR code. You can add questions there, and folks can upvote questions based on their preference. And so we'll take a look at those questions at the very end. And so I'd like to ask Ainsley next if you can speak to how the traditions of science need to be reshaped or rebuilt to include diverse populations.
Thank you, Melanie. I think one of the things I'd love to start with is funding. When we ask people to apply for funding grants, they typically are talking about their science and their long productivity record, but we should be asking them about their science teams that they're going to put together for the project that they're asking for funding for. So how diverse are their teams? How are they providing inclusive policies and practices for the members of their team? Do they have Indigenous scientists with them? Do they have non-Western scientists? Do they have people with disabilities? Do they have people who identify of color, Black people, women, all of those to us LGBTQ people on their team? And what sort of pieces are they putting into their project and their workplace to ensure that those people that are building their science careers under the principal investigator will be included and able to access equitable opportunities as part of their work? And so we need to be asking these questions when people do apply for funding. There's a lot of barriers for people with disabilities in performing lab work. When we talk about universal instructional design, we often apply it to the classroom, but we stop short when we apply it to designing scientific equipment that can be used by people in a number of ways of interaction, not just for relying on vision or hearing, or a tactile sensor and all these different things. And we're waiting for scientific to become more accessible. And in the meantime, we sort of make it mandate that people have to do lab work in order to become a scientist. But scientists often don't see the lab, so I think some changing around some of that gatekeeping needs to happen as well. And similarly with science being everywhere, lots of people, as Melanie mentioned, will need to have some knowledge of STEM somewhere, but we sort of expect them at the basic level to take math and physics and organic chemistry and all of these things, but maybe they're just interested in one little aspect of that. Is it not better for people to have some science rather than none at all if they're not able to do the science courses that we sort of have everyone to take? We need to look at authorship traditions and our biases around productivity cycles. So lots of people who have career interruptions, maybe it's a birthing person having a child and having a career interruption that way, or someone with a disability, or someone who just hasn't had a lot of opportunity because they're coming from some sort of a background where they haven't had the same opportunities as sort of a tall, white, cisgendered male, and we need to look at what our biases are around productivity and evaluate scientists who are applying for funding in a much more equitable type of way. I'm not going to go on too long because we don't have time, but those are some of the main things that I think would be hugely impactful if we were to change them.
Thank you. Hear, hear. You can totally engage and clap. We appreciate that. Commissioner Ward, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm just going to let all the panelists know that we can see her up on the screen there if you want to take a look. And so the first question that we wanted to ask you was, can you walk us through the concept of pay equity and elaborate on Ontario's Equal Pay Act?
Sure, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and congratulations on the symposium. And I'm sorry I'm not able to join in person, but I'm very glad I can share some insights with you. So as I jump into this, I think it's really important to establish what we mean by pay equity, because the concept of equal pay for equal work has been around for quite a long time, which is basically the idea, use a very basic concept here. If two people are on a line, regardless of, let's say, a manufacturing line producing widgets, or in a lab producing cells, regardless of their gender or gender identity or any of the sort of particulars of that employee, they ought to be paid the same amount of money because they are doing the same or substantially the same work. That's equal pay for equal work, and that concept has been around for quite some time. Well, actually since about 30s, 40s, 50s, it started to solidify in government policy. But women started demanding, and I'm using the term women intentionally because in the 1950s, the labor market wasn't, we didn't have concepts around or language around non-binary. So women in the labor market started to stand up and say, wait a minute, we're doing important work that is undervalued, and it's undervalued because we are women, because we know historically the labor market has been clustered into highly gendered concepts of jobs. And so we see, and we still see the remnants of this today, right? You guys are talking about the challenges of being women or different identities in sciences. The sort of this historical segregation of job classes of male and female, which started at the beginning more or less of the paid labor market, because we can go way back in time and we could see that men and women did very similar things. I used to say that, before the Industrial Revolution, a woman's place was in the home, but so was the man's, because the whole economic unit was basically the homestead, and the economic distribution of labor and production was equally spread because you needed everybody to participate in the production distribution of labor and of goods that were coming out of the homestead. So this highly segregated workforce is really where we see the value of work being prioritized in different ways. And the jobs that men were primarily doing and the jobs that women were doing were undervalued because they were done by women, and they were seen primarily as extensions of the home, as domestic work. And so we see that clustering persist in care work, clerical work, service work, where the historical segregation, and we literally had laws that said what type of work women could do and what type they couldn't do. Those have gone away, thankfully, but the social, cultural, religious mores that shape that ideology of what women should be doing and where they should be doing it persists subconsciously and through biases that exist in policy. So what the Pay Equity Act seeks to do is to challenge that, to say that there are jobs that are undervalued because of their historic devaluation as being gendered women or female job class, and men also can hold those job classes. And non-binary, we see all gender identities holding the job class. But we challenge the notion that it should be undervalued because of the type of job class it is. And so we push for equal pay for work of equal value. And the value part is where we force companies, this is a law, that companies have to do a gender neutral job evaluation system to see if jobs are being, what the value of the job is. And this is sort of a technical regression based process. And if values are similar and the gender of the job classes are not, they have to adjust the values to be the same. And so this is how we find that the most effective way to actually get rid of that gender bias in pay structures. So that's what we do and what the law requires employers to do.
Perfect. And a follow-up question to that is in the context of women in STEM. Can you share your insights on where we are versus where we can be? And also comment on how women are represented and paid in different STEM industries, particularly in Ontario?
Yeah, this was a fascinating research question for me to look at, because recently we started to we have a limited team, so we thought, let's use NAICS and NOx codes, North American Industrial Codes and North American Occupational Codes, to really understand the gender wage gap, because we work in averages, right? Like we can say that the average gender wage gap is 11%. But we know that there are sectors and subsectors that are performing better, where we see gender wage gaps as low as 2% in, say, utilities, for instance. We see it as high as 27 to 30% in, I think that was mechanical engineering. So it really varies. So we actually dove in because we saw that engineering overall was 7%, which is lower than the average. So we wanted to understand. So then we had to look at sciences and the STEM sector. And STEM overall is 14%, which is higher than the provincial and national average. So we started to, dive into this and say, okay, what are the specifics across sectors? And so, as I said, STEM overall rests at about 14%, which is slightly, these are all listed as applied sciences, except engineering, which is at 7%, which is, I guess, great news if you're in that space, except for, we see gender wage gaps in sciences for women at 8% if you're on the management spectrum, but 22% for supervisors or sort of that mid-level. So there's plenty of room for improvement, where it's kind of like good news, in metallurgical and material engineers. The gender wage gap is well, actually women out-earn men by 5%. And in petroleum and petroleum engineers, women out-earn men by 11%. Women mining and geological engineers, civil engineers, technologists, technicians, power engineers, the gender wage gap is less than 5%. So when we talk about the wage gap, it's really fascinating to get in and look at, especially in the sciences and applied sciences, by sector and subsector, because some areas are doing well in closing the gender wage gap and some need much more work and attention. And that's where my team dives in to do this work, so we know, whose door to knock on, because we have the legislative authority to knock on companies' doors, ask to see a pay equity plan or a gender neutral job evaluation system. And if they don't have it, it's the law to produce it. So this data gives us insight on, if there's a sector outperforming, we probably won't knock on their door. But if we see a subsector in the applied sciences where a gender wage gap is higher than the average, we will go ask for a gender neutral job evaluation system and pay gap analysis. And we know that the pay gap is influenced by a lot of factors. We don't have time to get into it, but I'm sure this is what you're going to be covering the entire 2 days here at your conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very, very detailed breakdown. I'm going to hand it over to Andrea. If you could walk us through some of the key social policies that the STEM sector should implement and advocate for.
Thank you, Melanie. Is my microphone on? Good. Thank you. Do I just press?
Yeah.
Okay. So if for the next few minutes, I've organized my comments as follows. I'm going to just start with a wide lens, and I'll share one insight from the 2023 Nobel Prize winner in economics. I'll share one insight from care work scholars and advocates. I'm going to focus on parental leave as one policy. That's the area that where some of my research is. And then I have a few calls to actions on parental leave. So the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences was established in 1969. Over its more than 50 years, it was awarded to just 2 women. Last month, the number rose to 3 when the Nobel Committee announced that the 2023 recipient was Claudia Goldin, an economics professor at Harvard University. She was chosen, quote, for advancing the world's understanding of women's progress in the workforce. Goldin's research looks at employment and pay differences between women and men, and she's only looking at 2 genders, I need to make that clear, across the past 2 centuries in global north countries. And she's looked at many professions, including professions in the STEM sector. And one of her key findings was on the gender wage gaps in the same profession. And so when she was awarded the prize, the Nobel Prize Committee wrote, historically, much of the gender gap in earnings could be explained by differences in educational and occupational choices. However, Goldin has shown that the bulk of this earning difference is now between men and women in the same occupation, and it largely arises after the birth of the first child. So this diagram was actually issued from the Nobel Prize Committee. So why is this the case? I'm sure that all of you know this, certainly the panelists do. It's not a biological issue. The birthing of a child takes several hours, maybe a lot of hours. But it's the days, months, years, and indeed decades of unpaid care work for children, for households, for communities, and the elderlies that matter here. Katie Ward just spoke about this. As many of you know, this work mainly falls on women. And paid work is still structured in ways that penalize people who have caregiving responsibilities. So my second wide point is that I want to underline the significance of this more broadly, which is that the economy and all human life are dependent on unpaid care work. So I'm going to take 50 years of theory and sociology and economics and other places and just make 5 brief statements. Unpaid care work, and what is called the care economy, upholds the so-called formal economy. Number 2, all human beings need care at the beginning of life, at the end of life, and at many points in between. Human beings are relational, interdependent, and sometimes, and indeed often, vulnerable beings. Number 3, we're all care receivers. We need to have equality in care receiving. But we all need to share as well the responsibilities for caregiving of both human and non-human life. Number 4, care is a human. It's not a female capacity. Number 5, to achieve equity in paid work, we also have to have equity in unpaid work. And so there's many policies that have been put in place to support that. Thank you. Woo. Including childcare, flexible work. Parental leave is the one I want to talk about. Now, I realize there's not a lot of men in the audience, but how many people who identify as men and are fathers in the room, including the people in the back, the technicians, have taken parental leave? Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so a few have taken parental leave.
We do have a live poll, but no matter, you can
Oh, the
switch over
live
to that.
poll?
There we
Okay,
go.
the live poll will come. Okay, so
You can flip over, sorry, Andrea, to
it's
the next
okay.
slide. Yeah.
So in Canada, 100%. Okay, the poll, we're not going to trust this data. I just want to make the point that in Canada, less than 20% of fathers take their parental leave entitlements. So this is 1 to 2 out of every 10 men. In Quebec, which has its own unique parental leave system, 8 out of 10 men take parental leave. So why is this important? Parental leave scholars, including myself, have repeatedly made the argument that fathers' take-up of parental leave is one of the levers for gender change in paid and unpaid work. There's research from the Nordic countries that demonstrate how men's take-up of leave, parental leave, can lead to reduced pay gaps between women and men. And so here are a few calls to action, just very quickly. For men and non-birthing parents, whether you're an employee or an employee, take your parental leave, because this sends a message to your staff and to your fellow colleagues that you are also responsible for caregiving and it's not being left on your partner. For students and postdocs, advocate for paid parental leave time for your graduate students and postdocs. If your postdocs and students are paid by NSERC, there is paid leave in that funding package, but most funding packages do not have any provision for paid leaves. And I've read about the leaky STEM STEM pipeline, where when women leave STEM, this could be one of the reasons. Financial top-ups is the third. In Canada, not including Quebec, most workers receive 55% of their salary when they're on leave. Some private companies and most public sector companies provide wage top-ups. To encourage more men to take leave and to support low-paid workers, we should lobby for improved incentives for employers who provide top-ups to EI-based benefits. And finally, my last call to action is around provincial and territorial employment standards. In Canada, all provinces and territories have different employment standards legislations, and so where you live matters as to whether or not you can actually take your leave entitlements. So to qualify for parental leave benefits, an employee must complete a specific period of continuous employment in the year before taking leave. In provinces such as British Columbia, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, no length of service is required. But in other provinces and territories, you have to work for the same employer for 3 to 12 months. Here in Ontario, you have to work 13 weeks with the same employer in order to receive the benefits. So if there is a lot of employee movement in the STEM sector across provinces and territories, then this matters as to whether employees will receive parental benefits. So lobby for universal standards across Canada for the legal right to take leave. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Andrea. I'm going to very quickly move over to our next panelist. Poe, in terms of STEM education, so this is that fourth bucket we spoke about. In terms of STEM education across the country, what's working, what isn't working, what can we do to ensure that our youth are learning at the rate that they will need to be employment ready, particularly as we enter this digital era?
Thanks for that question.
And we have a poll question, I think, that you wanted to ask.
Oh, yes. Let's see what the... So as we wait for the poll results, I mean, what things has worked has over the past many decades in STEM education is that there's an increase of more hands-on sort of learning in the K-12 education and also in non-formal and informal education. Other things is that there are a little bit more breaking of the silo between STEM at the elementary level as well. In addition, there's also a lot more sort of partnerships with community-based sort of organizations. So where I'm from the West Coast in Vancouver, places like Science World or the Botanical Gardens have participated a lot in non-formal education for students. But what hasn't worked is that there is not enough support for teacher development. STEM is a discipline where teachers at the elementary school level, sometimes they actually struggle with teaching science. And that is not a fault of their own, and it has many factors. Everything from pre-service teacher support, pre-service teacher readiness, as well as after they go into becoming a teacher, it's also the professional development that's available, particularly in STEM. Other things that's still a gap is that there's the curriculum. The curriculum, there's not one centralized curriculum that's across Canada. Every province is slightly different. In BC, for example, we just recently had our, in quotes, new curriculum put into place, where there's a lot more focus on flexibility that the teachers can take in their classroom. And in addition is that there is also more of a focus on first people's principles of learning as well in the classroom as well. But on that note is that there's also not enough support on supporting teachers how to teach with these principles, how to teach across the disciplines in STEM. If you look at STEM at the post-secondary level, past elementary school, the disciplines are quite siloed. So you're either learning science, or you're learning engineering, or you're learning math. There's very little crossover in the disciplines. And so when we want to prepare our youth, as Melanie say, for the digital age, what does that look like? Does that mean that you're only studying math or you're only studying engineering? Well, no. It has to break those disciplines and study across it from all different sort of perspectives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the second round. Other things is that funding. There's always the question about enough funding to support teacher development. When we talk about, I think Andrea, you were saying how there's the difference in that research about how education plays a role in the disparities and things like that. And it's true, because when you don't have teachers who are prepared to teach STEM from a place that they themselves feel confident in teaching, that they see the value in STEM, or they see that there are connections between STEM and arts and social sciences, then it becomes a discipline where it becomes siloed. And then it would link to times when I grew up learning science, when at first, I mean, I'm in science now, but at first I thought, wow, science is so boring. Like, if I want to do biology, is it all about memorization and memorizing the textbook and all these jargons that I have to do? But the teacher makes a huge difference. And so that's the other gap. And then the other ones is that in some parts of the country, and maybe in many parts of the country, access to basic internet even is a lack. And not only internet, if you have the internet, a lot of schools, and I can say for northern BC, is that there's a lack of technology, hardware, updated computers to even access that internet for information for both the teacher and the students. So in all, in the end, is that there is a slight disconnect between funding at the federal, provincial level, and on the ground in the classroom, inside and outside of the classroom for K-12 teachers. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Yeah. Harmy, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you're going to take us into the realm of GBV and what that looks like in the Canadian STEM sector. And if you could highlight some stats or data on why, together as a nation, we need to address various forms of GBV and STEM, and obviously that's going to have a lot of relevance in the digital era as well.
Yes. Hello. Testing. Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Melanie. Well, I have a few numbers here. You look like you like data and numbers. So I did prepare some numbers for you. I gotta say though, that in recent decades, gains have been made to the participation of women in STEM. And yet, these sectors remain male-dominated. So here you go, my first set of numbers. The 2016 Canadian census showed that across college graduates, men made up 30% of STEM graduates, and women made up 6%. Labor force statistics from 2020 show that women make up very low proportions in many industries, such as construction 13%, manufacturing 27%, transportation 22%. Again, this is as per Statistics Canada released in 2021. And while the gender gap is narrowing, these gains are coming with risks. Why do I say that? Well, as an increasing number of women enter these fields, they do face biases, barriers, harassment, and violence. Again, some more numbers for you. In Canada, in 2020 alone, listen to this. 47% of women working in trades, transportation, equipment, etc., reported experiencing inappropriate sexualized behavior at work. 47%. This is compared to 19% of men. Statistics Canada 2021. So both gender experienced it, but we can see the difference in terms of the percentage. Now, what does it look like? Obviously, this is probably not news. This is kind of general information, but just for the sake of mentioning today. Gender-based violence can take several forms. It could be harassment, discrimination, sexual harassment, cyberbullying, and online harassment. Underrepresentation is also a problem. I'm going to quickly move into this because I'm afraid I'm not going to have time later, Melanie. I'm going to go for it. Yeah. So let's just say, but Harmy, what I mean, where I work, we have our policies. They focus on resolving all of these incidents, no problems. Well, I'm here to tell you that unfortunately, most policies aim to deal with the after the fact and also to minimize legal liability. Those policies have not only proven to be ineffective, sorry to tell you, but can compound negative effects by enabling retaliation and re-victimization. What this is going to do is going to make your workplace fall into this dangerous cycle of underreporting and ineffective or harmful responses. But if you focus on proactive approaches, you could create a diverse, productive, and people-focused workplace. How do we do that? I'll leave that to the second round of questions.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, for this next round, it's kind of a lightning round of questions because we're on the clock. So if all of our panelists can be a little more concise, it's super appreciated. But let's get into it. Commissioner Ward, if we can join us back again, I think she's there with us. This question, could you provide an overview of the available data on how the gender wage gap varies across different STEM industries in Ontario, and what factors contribute to these variations?
Thank you. I talked a little bit about that in my previous answer, how we've looked at national occupation classification systems in order to do a deep dive. And we know that science broadly, or applied sciences, is at 14%, whereas the provincial and national average are at 11%. But that varies greatly within the STEM occupations. As I said, engineering is as low as 7%. Wage gap, which is great, and other engineering technologists or mining, geological engineers, the gap is less than 5%. And in fact, in a couple of subsectors, women are out earning men as well. So we're seeing such variety, which means that we have to dive into and understand. And some of the points have been hit here on what are the other causative factors. And I think this is what is astounding to us at the Pay Equity Office, and where we put time in research is that 70% of the gender wage gap remains unexplained. So Andrea talked a little bit about, well, in part, we could initially explain it by occupational choices in education. And I use choices very cautiously because there's still that legacy of like social, religious, cultural wars that define what women could do. And the choice argument is always a challenging one, to also build off what Andrea said in terms of the care economy and the paid care economy, but also the unpaid care economy, because there's expectations around gendered ideas of who does the care and the domestic work at home, which certainly plays into how the gender wage gap unfolds in the paid labor market, because women's choices, quote unquote, are constrained by social, religious, cultural wars and the values we placed on those expectations. So looking at 30% of the gender wage gap closing and why it exists, we can explain through research. Part of it is the occupational segregation, which I spent some time talking about. But that other 70% is really challenging and troubling, which we can make some assumptions. It's linked to bias, and so we have to really understand how to confront biases and changing social, religious, cultural wars around women and gendered identities in the workplace.
Thank you. Thank you for, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Ainsley, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I know you have a poll question as well. So during COVID, we watched the world come to a standstill and turn to science for a solution. And we have a plethora of 21st century challenges ahead of us. Do you think that the diversity of solutions required, and the diversity of thought actually required to tackle these challenges exists in Canada?
Thank you, Melanie. Excellent question. So just tying into that question as well, the poll question is, do you know anyone with a disability in Canada? The question was actually reworded. This is the wrong slide, but it was meant to say, do you know anyone who is a scientist in Canada with a disability? And if you want to raise your hand, you can. If you want to respond to the poll, you can. That's great too. A few people do. Great. We have a group of them here. Fantastic. So I think Canada is really rich in the intellectual resources that we need to solve the world's pressing problems where science can contribute to mitigating or managing those issues. But I think we have also a very big problem in that people in STEM who are from equity groups are generally not in leadership positions, and some equity groups aren't working in STEM at all. We don't have much data in Canada, actually. We have a little bit of data from Life Sciences Ontario on the life sciences sector and diversity in that, and there's a little bit of Canada-wide data on diversity in the life sciences sector across Canada. Shift Health has done a little bit of work on that. But it's not great data, but it is the only thing we have. And from that data, we know that persons of color are generally working in STEM, though not occupying leadership positions, similar with women. And people who identify as Indigenous or with disabilities, or some combination of that, they are not in STEM generally, very, very low levels. So promotion for them is not an issue. They're just not there in the first place. And so I think we need to be collecting this data at the government level, at the organizational level, and looking at it. Recently, my husband was asked to speak to the House of Commons on pay equity gaps for persons with disabilities in STEM. But that's a really hard topic to speak to because we don't know how many people are in STEM. Very little from what we know, but there is no good data on it. We know that persons with disabilities experience very significant wage gaps across other sectors, particularly as they get older, because persons with disabilities have a bias and that they face, and that people don't promote them. If you need an accommodation, you must not be capable of doing a higher level job, and that carries over into our ideas about STEM. So if you are from an equity group and you're promoting equity in STEM for persons who are Black, for persons who are of color, for LGBTQIA folks, all of those people have disabilities as well, and some of them may also identify as Indigenous. And I would just say that we really need to promote and look at our biases for all equity groups in STEM and start collecting better data to get an idea of who's actually in STEM and who isn't.
I know you have a picture of Dr. Wanda that you wanted to share.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
One last quick thing. On the slide, there's a picture of someone who identifies as a woman, Dr. Wanda Diaz, Diaz. She is Spanish, and she is an amazing astronomer. And she actually revolutionized her field by applying a different method. And her method that she developed wasn't the person who came up with it, but she did develop it so that astronomers can use it, was sonification. So the application of non-speech sounds using different frequencies and tones to portray data that would otherwise be shown visually. And she is a scientist who identifies as blind or partially sighted. And she actually did some work with sonification and found out that that method gave advantages to sighted astronomers, and now what they know about the stars using that method is far more than they would have known if they had only visual means to analyze the data. And so she works a lot at the African Observatory and with schools for the blind over in Africa, and readily engages kids with vision loss in science. And that observatory is working very hard to promote inclusion and equity in STEM. And I think Canada is very far behind. The United States has also done a number of initiatives to ensure that people with disabilities have a little bit more access to STEM and funding to STEM, although their stuff is not great. They're farther along than Canada is. So I think if Canada is not going to act soon, we are going to get left behind in the innovation of STEM that we need to solve our problems and keep our economy strong.
We need more of these ideas, yes? Yeah. We need this talent. We need this talent. Economically, we need this talent. Poe, Ainsley referenced Indigenous communities. If anyone is familiar with the numbers, the gaps, the numbers are alarming. So in terms of Indigenous communities across Canada, there are so many of them that are doing so much to close these education gaps for Indigenous youth across Canada. Through your work, can you highlight maybe 3 areas where effort needs to be concentrated to mitigate these gaps or eliminate them?
Thanks, Melanie. I just want to say first that I'm not Indigenous, and so I'm an immigrant and a settler to these lands and uninvited to these lands as well. So at this point, I just have to say that, beyond STEM education and education, I think the country, the government, sort of they're working through their challenges as well, and it's because is that there's historical inequities of Indigenous communities and Indigenous people because of the mistreatment and the colonization of many communities across Canada. And I think because of this has put them at a place where they're behind in so many things. But that being said, is that a lot of these communities are doing so much work in education and outside of education just to be present in the country where they belong. And when we talk about STEM education, I want to say, I know you used the words gaps, Melanie, but I want to say that maybe it's not about gaps. It's about repairing and reconciling what is broken, what was broken for a very long time. And it's about building trust. It's about growing relationships when it comes to Indigenous communities and people across Canada, not just different cities. And it's about walking alongside them and giving them the lead as well. When we talk about STEM education, I'm not talking about, the little nuances, details about what do we do in a classroom. It's about a more fundamental change on a countrywide level where we need to sort of take trust to a level where care is being sustained. It's about letting Indigenous communities lead in sciences, in education. What does that look like? Well, that looks like where learning is, for example, land-based, place-based, relationship-based, on heart-based. And it's also about looking at different narratives of how I'm teaching science. It's about language revitalization. And right before this panel, Andrew and I were talking about how the importance of language revitalization is because when we lose our language, we lose our culture. When you lose our culture, you lose your stories, your beliefs, your all the approaches that means who you are and who you're being. And culture is not just about stories, not just about practice. It's about the community, the heart, the feeling, the emotions, and it's a bigger thing than traditions or practices. It's so much more than that. It's also about the seeing, feeling, practicing of science, whether you're in the field, outside of the field, in the lab, at the table, on the panel. It's about privileging. It's about privileging other ways of knowing, other ways of learning science, other ways of doing science. And to end sort of my question, I just want to quote Elder Albert Marshall, a Mi'kmaq elder who does two-eyed seeing. And he says that two-eyed seeing is about co-learning, co-creation, when knowledge inquiry is about learning to be able to see in genuine, meaningful ways. The strength, it is about knowledge validation to ensure authenticity, but also the sacredness of that knowledge within STEM. And knowledge gardening, where we learn to walk our talk together, that we're not just talking, that we're actually practicing, not just in the lab, with our lives, transforming who we are. It is about bringing Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities together to use all of our understanding, Western science, Indigenous science, so we can actually leave the world a better place for everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we're going to have just 2 more panelists speak, and then we'll see if we can squeeze in a question. So, Nahida, I'm going to ask you this question. We have a long way to go, but we don't have a lot of time to reshape policies to adapt to the swift change, right, and the delta in the digital space, or that the digital space is going to bring about. So what approach should policymakers take to reshape policies in a way that's really, truly going to address these gaps?
All right, so I'll try to be quick with this. This is a question that you could go on and speak for hours on end. We have a tendency to try and create policies that are one size fits all, or as we call them sometimes, pan-Canadian policies, and these have gotten us so far, but these are not effective in the long run, and they will not address the barriers that we've been talking about. So we've seen a system-wide approach, we've seen a system-wide data collection, we've seen these are limited in their effectiveness. And I want to reiterate something that Ainsley said, because I truly believe that Canada is behind compared to our counterparts in the US and in the UK and other parts of the world. And if we don't address our policies properly, we are going to continue being behind. So if anything that you come out of from today, from what I'm saying, is that in order to address these policies, we need community-driven approaches. We need to be able to address policies down at the community level, be able to have conversations at the community level with the individuals that are needing the accessibility, the accommodations, that are needing the support in order to get us to where we need to be. And to that effect, the resources that we have, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need to be able to address the resources at a community level to the needs of the communities. Communities in northern British Columbia versus communities in Nova Scotia or northern Manitoba are completely different, and they're not going to be addressed with a one-size-fits-all. So for us to be proactive, flexible, we need to have policies that are actually down at the community level, and not just we're going to address the entire Canada with one policy. That's just not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And the last question over to you before we take a very quick audience question. Harmi, at the UN this year, at the Commission on the Status of Women, it was 192 member states. Actually, Poe and I, we sat there listening to all of those statements. And, with the exception of a few, pretty much all of them laid out a plan for addressing gender equality through STEM, but then also said we need a concurrent plan to address alarming rates of technology-facilitated GBV. You cannot have one without the other, because in order to exist in the digital space, we need to use the internet. And so to that, our question to you is, can you comment on where government policy, right, or policies are going to be most instrumental in mitigating GBV or technology-facilitated GBV?
Thank you, Melanie. I'll try to be quick.
I know.
Let me just start off by saying that gender-based violence is not an individual issue or problem. It's institutional. And gender-based violence certainly can have or be technologically facilitated. Absolutely. definitely more updated legislation to ensure that we can tackle the new forms of violence that are happening because of our gender, right? And so definitely something like that. But I also wanted to go back a little bit, forgive me on that, Melanie, in terms of the what do we do and how do we start tackling not only on the STEM sector, but our workplaces and our communities. And I'm gonna leave you with this. You know how we all have to take CPR training? Every year you have to be all of that. Well, I'm gonna leave you with the same words, APR. A community holistic approach to gender-based violence includes accountability through your workplace, through your institutions, educations, academia, climate surveys, for example. How are you doing? And how are you communicating those results? Are you being accountable to those results when it comes to gender-based violence? Number one. Number two, P, prevention, right? How are your policies? Are they easily accessible? Did you know? Can you tell me right now what's the process to respond to a disclosure at work? Are there report guides? Are there clear definitions? Are they easily accessible? Within prevention, are you training your staff? And that is very important because it's not reactive. When you train your staff about acceptable workplace conduct and developing a positive workplace culture, it will take you ahead of the game. You are preventing by talking about it and being meaningful about how important this issue is for you. And last but not least, response. What are the responses that you're having at work related to that in terms of reporting, responding to complaints, and most importantly, trauma-informed responses? What am I talking about? Empathy versus judgment. Making sure that you put yourself in that place when you're responding. Long story short, let's shift from legal liability and minimizing it to a culture of safety where everybody, as much as possible, feels safe at work and in your community.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I'm conscious of the time. Commissioner Ward, I think there's a question in here for you. And for the remaining questions, what we're going to do is I'm going to try to see if we can get this up on the SWIST website for some answers. So I'll stay tuned for that. But Commissioner Ward, there's a question here. And in 30 seconds or less, if you could maybe speak to this. For pay equity, complaints are not anonymous. So it's not necessarily an avenue to take if you want to keep your job and not face backlash. Do you have any words of wisdom?
So they actually are anonymous. I'm not sure the context of that question. If you come to our office, and actually we just launched a new form for review services, which is on our website. You can see how to put in a complaint. It's anonymized for the employer. There is actually a part of the Pay Equity Act that says people who are applying for a pay equity review cannot see any retribution or challenges from the employer, and that is something that can be litigated if the employee feels that their circumstances at work have changed because they put in an application to pay equity. They can then actually litigate that process as well. So encourage you to check out the new application form online, which might help address some of any tension or fears about applying for this process. But you are protected under the Act. If you do apply, there's a protection that you cannot have any retribution from the employer. If you experience that, you can come back and the employer can be penalized for that process if they're found to have actually behaved poorly or their behavior has changed towards the employee. So please do check out that application. And you can also call our info line, which is anonymous, and have a conversation with one of our review officers who can give you some additional insight on the process.
Amazing. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Julia. I'm going to thank all of our panelists. Julia, take it away.
Okay. Can you hear me? Hello?
And can I get my slide deck up whenever you're ready? So I'll get right into it. My name is Julie Hocko, and I'm an engineer. I work in the energy industry in Calgary, Alberta. I'm also the mother of 2 children, aged 4 and 7, and I'm the founder of the STEM Moms Project. So you're probably wondering, what is the STEM Moms Project and how can someone be so passionate about this topic? I spent 3 years doing fly-in, fly-out, living and working in northern Alberta and oil sands camps. And it wasn't until I had children that I started to question, do I belong here? Do I belong as a woman in STEM? And what I found was the more and more of my peers that I spoke with, both from school and also who I worked with and within the industry, they all had the same feeling. It was this transition to parenthood that they found to be particularly difficult, and also that their organizations and their leaders were not prepared to deal with because it was male-dominated, and often the man did not have the life experience to help that woman navigate this transition of her life. Also, I heard so much about this mid-career leaky pipeline. I couldn't figure out why is no one talking about the motherhood aspect in the mid-career leaky pipeline. We hear about care work, and we hear about the demands at home, but specifically helping women transition at this very challenging point in their life, there was not a lot of content about it. And so 2 years ago, in February 2022, I put a post on LinkedIn and I said, this is something I'm very passionate about. I want to talk about it. Who wants to be part of this project, examining the unique barriers at the intersection of woman in STEM and working parent? And within 2 weeks, we had a Slack group set up. We had over 70 women admitted to that group who wanted to discuss it. And they would introduce themselves and they would say, I want to be part of this project because, and every single because was a challenge or a barrier that they themselves had encountered. And so we started to create a list. There was 40 barriers, and we decided, let's start talking about them. So within Slack, we were talking about each barrier and saying, how have you personally been affected by this specific topic? And I would take all of the summaries, and initially we thought, well, we'll just do diversity moments. We're gonna talk about these topics, we're gonna go back to our workplaces, and we're gonna create some awareness. But the project gained so much momentum that I've gone ahead and I've created a report, and that's what I'm going to share with you here today. So for our 15 topics we were able to get through in the 1 year period, there was 10 to 40 participants for every single topic, and eventually we transitioned from Slack and we started using Google Forms because Google Forms was anonymous, and these are very sensitive topics. Here are the 15 topics that we were able to get through in the 1 year period. And so I'll just point out a couple because I'm short on time here today. But number 1 is the burnout culture. So if you don't have children and you are in an industry where you have to be on all the time and available all the time, but you don't have any demand, it's probably already hard to keep up. Now you're adding in the childcare demand, it's going to be almost impossible. And so this was one of the hot topics that we came out the gate with, that everyone said, this is really relevant to me. I'm finding it so difficult to keep up in this type of an environment, in a corporate environment. Also the mental load. Anyone who is a parent or knows anything about parenting is going to be very familiar with this term, the mental load. It is remembering all of the things. It is remembering the 10 things that need to be in that backpack at the beginning of every day for each of your children, and where they need to be and when they need to be there and how they're going to get there, and every single bit of logistics that helps. So you put that on top of already being in a job with high stress, it's incredibly difficult. And I also want to draw your attention to career gaps. Career gaps is something that we talked about, and this is anyone that took a gap beyond that 12 to 18 month parental leave. These are people who actively decided, I'm going to step away for a period of time because I want to be with my family and be with my children. And the sad reality is the challenges to getting back into these STEM professions is incredibly difficult in a male-dominated space. If you step away and you want to come back in, you have confidence issues, you're trying to sell yourself, you're trying to convince people that you are still prioritizing careers, that you're still capable. And we had 36 participants within this topic, and the results were not favorable. So I've gone ahead and I've summarized the results from the 15 topics, and I've written a report on these. And number 1 recommendation, women in STEM support is very highly weighted in the early career areas. And so we know that we want more women in STEM, and we're trying to attract them. So university, early career. And then we also want women in leadership. And so there's a lot of supports for women in leadership, but in the middle, that middle support, there's not a lot of supports there for women in STEM groups. And so recommendation number 1 is if we could have more support to help women where they're at, to stay in the game, to stay in that pipeline so that we have this healthy pipeline to feed the leadership. Recommendation number 2 is focused on actions for allies. And so a big part of the project was women don't have a lot of time, and we don't want them spending their money to fix themselves. And so a big part of the STEM Moms project was how can other people make changes in their lives and their day-to-day to support the women in their life. So if you look at this mind map, it shows you all of the people that have the capability to be an ally for a woman who is also, a STEM woman who is also a parent. We had 12 actions that allies can implement, and I've categorized them into these 4 categories that you see before you. Number 1, safe environment. So these are things like psychological safety. As a leader, and even as a co-parent, are you creating that environment where the individual feels safe to come to you and ask for what they need without fear of negative repercussions? This is psychological safety. So maybe you're coming back from leave, maybe you're having real difficulty with your child and transitioning to daycare, and you need some sort of accommodations. Perhaps that asking to work from home more than what's allowed in your office. Are you going to be negatively impacted now because you asked for that? I hope that the answer is no, but often the answer is yes. Also, having managers who are not making assumptions. They're not making assumptions about your career path or what you want for your career. Instead, they're using open communication to ask you and to get your input. Leadership, we heard this earlier, talking about leaders who are empathetic, leaders who are vulnerable, making it okay for you to also be vulnerable and ask for what you need. Workplace cultures that have flexibility. So flexibility could be working part-time. It could be you work 7 to 3 and the rest of your coworkers work 9 to 5. It could be that you work from home X number of days a week. Also having workplaces that really support work-life integration. And mentorship. Often I think when we think of mentorship, it's this formalized, really structured program with a junior and a senior individual. Mentorship can be anybody. You can have peer mentorship. Anyone in the office can mentor a STEM mother. So moving on to the last set of recommendations, because I work in technology and innovation within the energy space, I couldn't help but think, what could we do that doesn't require any incentive for people that could kind of create this change over time? So I'm thinking long periods, like the next few decades. So 2 came to mind for a full career life cycle. I'm talking from the beginning of your career to the end. If we think about in the workplace, you have an end of year review every year where you check and say, did my performance support the company's goals? And I would ask you, are you having that same assessment for yourself, right? Did my performance this year support my life goals? Is this where I want to be? Is this role sustainable for me for the next 2 to 10 years? Does this support my career growth? And what I want to say here is that we're not conditioned to ask those things. We don't do those reviews every year. But what if we did those reviews, and then when you hit that hard time, when you had your kids, you felt like you were struggling, and you don't have time to do this assessment, it's like a muscle. You know how to do it because you've always been doing it. And the same thing with a work-life integration. Work-life integration within the project, the majority of the participants felt that they learned through trial and error. They didn't know about work-life integration until they had to. And so what if workplaces conditioned and supported their workers to always take advantage of altering their work to support their life? When you need it, you're going to be better able to prepare. And lastly, I want to identify that we need to elevate and spotlight and highlight 2 specific groups, the first being untitled leaders. A lot of people in STEM professions are technical because they love technical work. However, in society, we glorify the ladder climb, the management title. And so what we found in the project was that a lot of the participants felt like their careers hadn't progressed and they didn't feel like they were the success status because they didn't have a management title. But when in fact, if you have a career that gives you that work-life balance that you like and you feel like you're contributing every day and you're adding value, that is success. And if you can feel success like that, you're able to stay in the game and hopefully move on to leadership in future. And lastly, we don't talk about dual working parents. Only 19% of Canadian households have a stay-at-home parent, whether it's a stay-at-home wife or a stay-at-home dad. all we talk about is working mothers. And it's true. In society, we do the majority of the unpaid work. However, I will admit that within the project, the majority of the participants had spouses who did contribute to half of the childcare, right? And so we need to talk more about the benefits for dads to be involved in the home. They need to be equal in the home. They need to have these fulfilling and meaningful relationships with their children, right? And we need to value dads in the home so that we can value mothers in the workplace. So that was a lot in 10 minutes. I'm here for the rest of the morning. I'm happy to chat further. The full report is 30 pages. It's stemmomsproject.com. You can find it online. You can also follow STEM Moms Project on LinkedIn, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Julie Hacko. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thanks to everybody else who's here today. Really amazing stuff. I'm a super early career young researcher who happens to be a woman. And so a lot of this is particularly of interest to me and is really cool to hear. So thank you all for being here today. We are just about 5 minutes behind schedule, so we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. And we'd love to have you all back here right at 9:30 when we're going to get started with our next panel. Thank you so much. Thanks.